Good afternoon, everyone. So happy that you're here today. So I'd like to get started. Tody, can you hear me there in the back? Very lightly. Can you turn the sound up? How's that? Is that better? Thank you. Dearest SCP family, I'm so very grateful to stand before you as we gather for the first time in 3 years to celebrate our discipline, our division, and each other. My name is Amy Reynolds, and before I offer my vision for the transformative journey we must take together, I want to briefly share how I entered this space and time. As I did just a year ago, announcing my presidential initiatives. I am a white cisgender woman who uses she, her pronouns, a lesbian, able-bodied human, raised middle class and Catholic in white suburban spaces, and a late career counseling psychologist and university professor. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s in a time of great social unrest when I was too young and too privileged to notice or understand. I have 4 siblings, including a gay brother who has lived with HIV since 1988, and I also have a gay or lesbian sister as well. I've been partnered for almost 34 years with the love of my life, Rochelle, a Black woman. Together, and with intentionality and a justice ethic, we raised 2 biracial Black identified children in a time when families like ours were like unicorns, beautiful yet unknown to most. Justice and Mandela are now incredible young adults, and we couldn't be prouder. I'm beyond thrilled that Rochelle, Justice, and Mandela are here today to share this moment with me. Today, we are on the land where the water reflects the sky, or Minnesota Makoche, as first named by the Dakota people. The Minneapolis-St. Paul area is one of the most tribally urban areas in the United States. Greater Minnesota is home to 11 tribal nations, including 8 Ojibwe and 3 Dakota nations. This is largely due to the 1956 Indian Relocation Act, which was designed to defund reservations and move Indigenous communities to cities in hopes of destroying Indigenous cultures, ways of life, and rights through assimilation and violence. Some of the lands in this area were technically ceded through treaties, but we know those negotiations were inhumane, unjust, and rigged from the start, resulting in the forced removal of many. Over time, countless lands and rights were stolen. The facts are as immutable as they are tragic. These government actions have resulted in unspeakable harms, including cultural theft, poverty, loss of language and identity, and other forms of violence. It is also critical, though, to highlight this Indigenous land as a source of strength and community. Minneapolis is where AIM, the American Indian Movement, began. And since then, this region has seen much Indigenous resistance and rebirth. As powerfully described by the Native Governance Center here in Minneapolis, despite centuries of colonial theft and violence, this is still Indigenous land. It will always be Indigenous land. Indigenous people are not a relic of the past. We are still here, and we continue to demonstrate our talents and gifts amidst a backdrop of ongoing colonialism and oppression. We are worth celebrating. Minneapolis is home to over 16 nonprofit organizations, such as the American Indian Opportunities Industrialization Center, or the Wakan Tipi Center and the Lower Faline Center, Creek Project, I guess, as part of the Urban Indigenous Legacy Initiative that is focused on transforming and creating thriving Indigenous communities. Sean Sherman, the owner of Owamni, where some of you have eaten this week if you are lucky to get a reservation, a modern and award-winning Indigenous restaurant in Minneapolis, also shared, North America's history begins with Indigenous history. Now it is time to step up all together. Now is time for evolution and revolution. We are reclaiming Indigenous narratives, Indigenous spaces, and Indigenous food pathways that were broken with colonization. We will be the answers to our ancestors' prayers, but we can't do it ourselves. We will rise together. Minneapolis is also a place where a Black man, George Floyd, was murdered by Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, killed by, like so many other Black people, by either state violence or the racist acts of individuals and communities. His murder, with the whole world watching, lit a spark that generated true change in some areas and temporary change in other spaces. George Floyd Square on the corner of 38th and Chicago Avenue here in Minneapolis has become a place to remember, mourn, rage, heal, dream, and center Black lives. That corner holds other memories as well. This intersection serves as the edge of one of the many racial covenants in Minneapolis in the early 1900s, where Black families were forbidden from living in certain neighborhoods. This led to long-term segregation and loss of generational wealth. And it should be no surprise that these intersections is where over-policing often occurs. The shadow of anti-Black racism looms large in Minneapolis, as it does in every community, and that reality must be acknowledged wherever we go. Minneapolis, once the home of Dred Scott, is now a place where the push to abolish the police took hold in radical imagination, and organizing has blossomed through the powerful work of organizations like Reclaim the Block and Black Visions Collective. It is always our responsibility to tend to and honor our surroundings, center the lives and truths that encircle us, and ground our praxis in the lived experiences of all humanity. Acknowledging when and where we enter is essential to the work we do. These prescient words of Anna Julia Cooper in her 1892 book of essays on the power and agency of Black women in the early years of Black codes and Jim Crow underscore the importance of the contextual factors that counseling psychology has long embraced, even when others in psychology did not. I've highlighted the where through spotlighting Minneapolis as a proxy for all our communities that struggle to birth and nurture inclusive and just spaces. It is equally important to recognize when, or the current moment in time, and its impact on us. Now is a time like no other, and we must stop, look, and listen as if our lives depend upon it, because they do. Deciding where to begin when bracketing this moment is challenging, because the foundations of this hour are rooted in the enduring colonialism, anti-indigeneity, and anti-Black racism of this country. We are living in a time of unprecedented challenges to our democracy, including voter suppression and the insurrection on January 6, 2021. There have been intensifying assaults on bodily autonomy, including the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade and the increasing targeting of queer and trans youth. Rising white supremacy and extremism puts us all at risk. So many factors and events are pivotal to the current unraveling of our mental health, our community and government structures, and the precious health of our planet. Then, of course, there's the pandemic, which continues to shine a spotlight in the profound inequities and traumas in our country and the world, and signal the precarious nature of democracy and the dangers of capitalism. This disruptions caused by the pandemic and these foundational realities are horrific because they bring death, destruction, and despair to so many communities. They also offer us an indisputable opportunity to remake, recalibrate, and re-envision our world. In the brilliant words of Arundhati Roy in her essay, "The Pandemic is a Portal," whatever it is, coronavirus had made the mighty kneel and brought the world to a halt like nothing else could. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past, and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. So into this moment, we all enter with halting breath, racing heart, and aching spirit, knowing that this is a time when, as counseling psychologists, we must make critical choices. Will we take this moment, this beautiful, painful, tragic moment, to rethink our purpose, center the margins, as Bell Hooks encouraged us to do, re-envision our goals, and transform our discipline. We can continue our current trajectory, making incremental changes in the face of unyielding resistance and undisputable harm. Or we can choose to untangle the history and practices of our profession from whiteness and re-envision what it means to be counseling psychologists so that our values as a holistic, developmentally grounded, person and community-centered, contextually aware and systems-oriented, prevention and strength-based, and advocacy and justice-oriented discipline are grounded in critical consciousness and liberatory practice. In the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. I want to share a bit about my positionality, and I think it's best noted by this quote by Nikki Giovanni. If you don't understand yourself, you don't understand anyone else. Like all of us, I've previously shared with you my identities and experiences, and they shape who I am and how I view the world. My own journey towards justice was not fully cultivated until graduate school. It was there that I learned about optimal development from Dr. James Myers, alongside my friends Suzette Spite, Eve Adams, and Tricia Hanley. And it was there I engaged in my first activism to force my campus to divest from South Africa. Like most white people, I was late to understanding myself as a white racial being. But for the past 40 years, I have actively worked to interrogate how my whiteness shows up in the world, both personally and professionally. Transformational spaces, beginning in the early 1990s with Women Against Racism in Iowa City, and a multiracial group of women committed to dismantling racism in ourselves and others, all the way up to the current day to being a member of the Liberation Lounge, or Liberation Incubator. Lounge, cool place too. Birthed by Dr. Annalise Singh in 2020, and so many experiences in between. These have created opportunities for me to deeply challenge myself and my whiteness. I'm blessed to have a partner who's not afraid to call BS when I avoid difficult truths. The same could be said for my children as well. Several years ago, I had a conversation with my daughter Justice when I asked her whether I had engaged in microaggressive behaviors as a white parent. She thought about it for a minute and shared that there was none that she could recall, but then she paused, smiled, and said, "But Mom, you are so white." I knew that meant that there was more for me to uncover and disrupt regarding how my whiteness intervenes when I'm aware and when I'm unaware, and even when I'm trying to be self-aware. I openly share and acknowledge my positionality in a space in a moment like this because all of us must own and interrogate what has shaped us so we can infuse critical consciousness, particularly critical action, into our clinical teaching, scholarship, administrative, and advocacy practice. In preparation for this talk, I read past SCP presidential addresses with a specific focus on what our presidents of color shared. President after president offered critiques of how we operated as a discipline and a division, and urged us to change and live up to our values of diversity and inclusion. The heartfelt plea for inclusion began with Dr. Rosie Phillips Davis, the first president of color within SCP, urging us to make the circle bigger. And while Naja Fuad started us dreaming of a different world in her talk, it was Dr. Annalise Singh who urged us to dream and build a liberatory counseling psychology. At the end of her presidency, she shared, "I want to look back and say that it was a year we felt the impulse towards liberation even more deeply, and that we followed that impulse to change everything we thought we knew about counseling psychology, about what counseling psychology could be." Many past SCP presidential addresses also focused on their initiatives. Many powerful projects have been created over the years, and some have had lasting effects on our division. I too am proud of the work that has been done through my initiatives, and I will briefly highlight what has been accomplished and how it relates to my vision for counseling psychology. Then I will focus on what it will take for counseling psychology and SCP to become an actively, radically, and undisputedly anti-racist discipline and division committed to decolonizing and dismantling the systems that continue to perpetuate harm and prevent liberation through unexamined whiteness, white supremacy structures and practices, and colonial mentality. When thinking about my presidential initiatives, my favorite quote by Octavia Butler rings true. "All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you." The only lasting truth is change. My presidential theme was transforming counseling psychology through critical consciousness and radical change. The goal of this theme was to push us to transform what we do in deep and meaningful ways. We can no longer be content to change incrementally, and instead must prioritize sustained structural and systemic change that transforms everything we do. One reason I ran for SCP president was because of my deep desire to affect how we teach and train counseling psychologists, which is why my first presidential initiative was transforming counseling psychology curriculum and praxis. While valuing diversity, multiculturalism, and social justice has been identified as central to our identity, we have not fully enacted those values within our training programs. Despite our values, our curriculum, whether in a doctoral program, an internship, or postdoc, is based on Eurocentric, positivistic perspectives, frameworks, theories, and scholarship. Rather than centering scholars of color, queer and trans scholars, and scholars from other marginalized groups, our curriculum often sprinkles in those scholars and their work as alternatives to the standard psychological canon. Instead of making critical perspectives and theories foundational to counseling psychology, they are often relegated to multicultural or social justice classes. Although the profession-wide accreditation standards set by APA require infusion of multicultural content in all courses and training, there's no agreed upon understanding of what multicultural infusion means. And while there's been increased attention on decolonizing the curriculum, there appears to be limited understanding of what it would mean to indigenize what and how we teach. Instead, changes to the curriculum and our training programs are typically additive, incremental, and far too often surface level. The Transforming Counseling Psychology Curriculum and Praxis Initiative focused on creating work groups to critically examine and deconstruct how various competencies, courses, and internship postdoc seminars are currently taught, and then reimagine and reconstruct new and transformative ways to teach and train. My second transformative initiative, presidential initiative, Transforming Who We Are Through Centering Indigenous People and Perspectives in Counseling Psychology, grew out of my deep personal commitment to uplifting indigeneity. In recent years, there have been calls to decolonize the counseling psychology curriculum. And while I agree in the importance of such efforts, I don't believe that we as a profession can do so until we fully grasp what decolonization means. Decolonization, like anti-racism, is often seen as synonymous with social justice and multiculturalism, which is why Tuck and Yang strongly urge that we not use decolonization as a metaphor. From their perspective and those of many Indigenous scholars, decolonization cannot exist without reparative efforts that reinstate Indigenous life and land. McCubbin et al. Further state, the task of liberation from colonial oppression requires not only land and material resources, but also decolonization of the mind. Freedom from colonial domination requires that we critically engage and deconstruct knowledge systems based on white and Western ideology. Before we leap into decolonizing efforts, we must first center Indigenous people and perspectives in counseling psychology. This initiative brought together a group of diverse Indigenous counseling psychologists to dream and discover how to create a counseling psychology that embraces Indigenous people and perspectives. This led to two efforts: a special task group of Indigenous counseling psychologists led by Drs. Lolly McCubbin and Dr. Anita McAbee, and a series of community building events for student ECP, MCP, Indigenous counseling psychologists led by Dr. Jill Fish. It's important to acknowledge that these discussions have happened before in counseling psychology, including an important 2012 article in the Counseling Psychologist entitled "The Interrelationship Between the Society of Indian Psychologists and the Society of Counseling Psychology," written by Drs. Jackie Gray, Paula Carter, Teresa Lamframboise, and Dee Bigfoot. This is an example of what happens in SCP. We make efforts towards inclusion, and because there are no structural or institutional changes to support those initiatives, they often fade with time and leadership transition. I want to briefly share some of the lessons learned and future hopes that I'm taking away from this presidential initiative. First and foremost, work groups are not enough. They are not the intervention. Work groups rarely create meaningful change, but they can help prepare a path. The first STIG meeting focused on issues such as Indigenous representation within counseling psychology, but later conversations became less about counseling psychology and more about the needs and issues within a diverse group of Indigenous counseling psychologists. What I did not realize is that what was needed was a sacred space for Indigenous counseling psychologists where they could heal from their training experiences and build community. And what I, as a white counseling psychologist, need to do is to work with other non-Indigenous counseling psychologists on developing the necessary organizational structure and supports to create and sustain an active and engaged community of Indigenous counseling psychologists, while also seeking to decolonize SCP by embracing Indigenous epistemologies and learning how to indigenize our field in both its knowledge bases and practices. This means disrupting the barriers that prevent Indigenous people from accessing graduate degrees in counseling psychology, creating safe spaces in our training programs, and encouraging Indigenous counseling psychologists to become involved in SCP. This requires going beyond land acknowledgements and building connections with local Indigenous communities. At this week's executive board meeting, we voted to donate funds to the Native American Community Clinic here in Minneapolis as a first step in a process where we will commit to engage with and make an annual donation to either an Indigenous community or organization that serves Indigenous communities located near the site of the APA convention. In the future, I hope we will expand our support by providing money for Indigenous students and ECPs to attend APA and build connections with SCP. But even that is not enough. We must commit to reaching out to understand the needs of Indigenous communities and learn how we as counseling psychologists can have a positive and a meaningful impact on those communities. That means building partnerships with Indigenous communities near us and supporting their efforts and their initiatives with resources and mutual aid. It also means working with Indigenous youth and encouraging them to create an indigenized psychology that can heal and benefit their community. My third and final presidential initiative, Transforming SCP Policies, Structures, and Practices, builds on the work I've been doing throughout my career on creating multicultural change in higher ed. This initiative was addressed primarily through collaboration with our consultants and the Everyday Reparations and Counseling Psychology Work Group. In September 2020, after extensive conversations, the executive board developed and distributed an RFQ for consultants to assist with dismantling anti-Black racism in SCP. In that RFQ, we stated, as SCP, we are not absolved of anti-Black racism and upholding structures of white supremacy and white culture in our organization. We recognize that anti-Black racism exists in SCP. For instance, we acknowledge that our members did not elect any of the 5 Black candidates who ran for top leadership positions in SCP this year. We are committed to gaining a critical understanding of this outcome in order to move forward and strengthen our society's work towards decreasing and eradicating anti-Black racism. Furthermore, we are committed to identify internalized whiteness within ourselves and our organization to help our members do the same. We stated we were seeking to hire a Black consultant who can observe and examine SCP at work, advise on ways SCP to dismantle current and racist and harmful structures, and recommend best practices around building and institutionalizing anti-racist thinking, operations, and actions. Through that process, we identified Jernigan and Associates and have been working with a team of 3 esteemed counseling psychologists, Doctors Miriam Jernigan-Noesi, Janet Helms, and Carlton Green. They have attended cabinet, executive board, and other relevant division meetings, reviewed all division documents, and closely examined our website and social media. They've held small group meetings, interviewed individual members of our division, and convened multiple community conversations. They intentionally focused on gathering information and feedback from Black counseling psychologists and graduate students to center their voices, perspectives, and experiences. They're in the process of writing their final report, honing their recommendations, and creating an implementation and sustainability plan. In addition to our collaboration with Jernigan and Associates, a work group birthed by Dr. Annalise Singh at the end of her presidency to address everyday reparations in counseling psychology was born. The goal of the Everyday Reparations Work Group was to guide the SCP community through a reparation lens in our efforts to disrupt anti-Blackness and center anti-racism in our mission, goals, and actions. This group has engaged in a variety of activities, including Liberation Lounge programs and a webinar to educate our members on the relevance of reparations as a framework for understanding our critical work, the critical work we must do. The goal of these programmatic efforts is to expand the knowledge, tools, and strategies for institutional transformation to stop the current harms being done to Black counseling psychology, graduate students, and psychologists, and level the playing field to address past inequities and harms. By focusing on how to deconstruct and radically change our training programs, internship and postdoc spaces, and professional work in clinical, academic, administrative, and advocacy spaces, we will be better equipped to reduce barriers, dismantle anti-Black racism, and center liberation. If I had my way, instead of me delivering this talk, as a group, we would watch the Reparations and Counseling Psychology, a Call to Action webinar, and then discuss it as a community. I strongly encourage each of you to take the time to view this critical webinar, which is on our YouTube page, and use it in your daily work. Creating presidential initiatives and special task groups has been an important part of the leadership model within Division 17, and some outstanding programs or efforts have come from these initiatives. However, it's becoming increasingly clear that how we operate as a division needs to be retooled and reimagined if we want to answer the calls to become a professional association that prioritizes uprooting anti-Black racism, decolonizes our knowledge base and practices, disrupts the white hegemonic structures and practices that live in our division, and centers the voices and perspectives of all marginalized communities. That will require commitment and inclusive engagement, cultural humility, and critical consciousness, but most importantly, radical action. The need for radical change is best spoken to by this quote by Angela Davis. You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time. In case my point of view is not yet clear, there's a need for radical change in our discipline and our division. We need to re-examine our priorities, dream build what is necessary, prioritize engagement with our members, solidify the external impact that we as counseling psychologists want to have on the larger profession of psychology and the world around us, and finally, center advocacy in everything we do. For the last year, we have begun that deep and difficult work in division leadership with the assistance of Jernigan and Associates. An intensive leadership retreat held earlier this week continued that focus as we chart our path forward. It is vital that we as a discipline and a division acknowledge the harm we have done on an individual and collective basis. It is, after all, our ethical mandate to do no harm. So it is vital that we actively interrogate and reflect upon the ways we have caused harm through both our action and our inaction. In recent years, the ethnic minority psychology associations have done extensive work to develop culture-specific and inclusive ethics, and pushed APA to revise its current ethics code so it is relevant and appropriate for all communities and no longer perpetuates only Western colonial values. Anchoring our ethics into collective community centeredness and healing will help to transform how we conceptualize our responsibility and accountability as a profession. Our literature is replete with scholarship highlighting the experiences of students, faculty, psychologists, and others who have been harmed in their training and their work settings due to the spoken and unspoken colonial values and norms, white supremacist characteristics, and adherence to the status quo. There are countless conference presentations, individual stories, and anecdotes that further highlight the biases, harms, and traumas that continue to this day. White supremacy and racism still exist in every corner of psychology at interpersonal, cultural, and institutional levels. Heteropatriarchy, ableism, classism, heterosexism, cisgenderism, anti-Muslim and US-centric and anti-Jewish worldviews are an undeniable part of the psychology canon. While such statements may seem strong to some, it only takes a little research to prove their veracity. The links between eugenics and psychology are not just in the past. And conversion therapy efforts of some licensed psychologists today are just two examples of the challenges we still face. It is time to move past broad and theoretical acknowledgements of these realities and get into the uncomfortable and immutable facts. It is time to do the deeper work, addressing, repairing, healing, and transforming these realities and engaging in critical and reparative actions. The Everyday Reparations Work Group spent significant time discussing and examining the harms being done specifically to Black counseling psychology graduate students and psychologists across the developmental spectrum, from attempted entry into graduate school through graduate training and ongoing professional work as counseling psychologists. The problems range from erasure to denial to overexposure and dehumanization. While these realities are true for all people of color, queer and trans individuals, non-US individuals, first generation and low income folks, for the purposes of this section, I will focus specifically on Black counseling psychology graduate students and psychologists. This singular focus on anti-Black racism likely may make some of you uncomfortable, but the renewed, reinvigorated, and all but state-sanctioned anti-Black racism in this country is at critical crisis levels and demands that we triage and center this focus. I truly believe it's, as counseling psychologists, that we are no strangers to triage. It's impossible for a counseling center practitioner or an independent practitioner to rank the pains of clients on a waiting list. Yet it's common practice for us to prioritize and treat those most at risk for harm. The same must be true for how we respond in this moment and why this focus on anti-Black racism must be a priority. The only way forward is with a reparation lens to inform and guide us in understanding what has happened, what continues to happen, and what we need to do next. The Everyday Reparations Work Group relied heavily on the Reparations Now toolkit created by the Movement for Black Lives, which provides a good working definition offered by the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, a process of repairing, healing, and restoring a people injured because of their group identity and in violation of their fundamental human rights by governments, corporations, institutions, and families. Those groups that have been injured have the right to obtain from the government, corporation, institution, or family responsible for the injuries that they need to repair and heal themselves. There are 5 conditions essential for full reparations. Number 1, cessation, assurance, and guarantee of non-repetition. Number 2, restitution and repatriation. Number 3, compensation. Number 4, rehabilitation. And number 5, satisfaction. These 5 conditions are most often discussed in the context of government-based harms. However, they're just as relevant within an educational and professional context. The first condition, cessation, assurances, and guarantees of non-repetitions, is quite simple. Stop the harm, and then offer assurances that there will be ongoing efforts to prevent future harm from happening. While it's simple to envision, it is difficult to enact and maintain without radical and significant structural changes in our institutions. The second condition, restitution and repatriation, is challenging because it requires that individuals and communities be made whole again from the harms and brought back to how they existed before the harms. Higher education and systems of mental health have been steeped in anti-Blackness from the beginning, so true restitution and repatriation is daunting and possibly unattainable. However, in cases where restitution is not possible, then compensation is suggested. Compensation is what most people think of when they think of reparations. Compensation requires that harmed Black individuals and communities be compensated through economic and other means. And it is vital that such efforts be proportional to the harms. Rehabilitation, the fourth component, requires providing legal, psychological, medical, and other resources to help Black individuals thrive rather than just survive. It is vital that such services be focused on liberation and freedom based in strategies and frameworks developed by the Black communities. The purpose of restitution, repatriation, compensation, and rehabilitation is to level the playing field so that Black individuals and communities can flourish by reclaiming their humanity and ensuring their success. Finally, the fifth condition, satisfaction, is truly the result of the previous conditions being met. However, given the difficulties in achieving full restitution and reparations, other means, such as Black-centered care, affinity groups, and apologies, are needed. So what does reparations mean for counseling psychology? Reparations must begin with identifying the harms that occur on the individual, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional level. Table 1 in my paper highlights some of these harms specified by the work group. While the table is not exhaustive, it does provide a clear picture of the extensive and almost endless parade of harms currently being experienced by Black counseling psychology graduate students and psychologists. In table 2 in this paper, the Everyday Reparations work group identified some actions that we must take to ensure that we are approaching transformation within our discipline and division with a reparation lens. It is vital that we begin a national conversation across training programs to discuss these harms and possible remedies in significant detail. Reparations must always have a financial component because past and present harms have inequitable financial effects and consequences on many Black counseling psychology graduate students and psychologists. However, there are also educational, psychological, medical, social, and occupational harms. Perhaps it is time for a truth and reconciliation process with counseling psychology to acknowledge, document, and account for the negative effects of the colonial and anti-Black frameworks and practices of psychology. A similar effort is currently underway within the Canadian Psychological Association as they address the report of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The CPA has acknowledged accountability and apologized for the failure of psychology in Canada to follow their own ethical standards and for harming First Nations people. There are discussions of possible accreditation requirements to ensure that all psychology graduate students in Canada are aware of the TRC report and are educated about culture-specific forms of treatment and Indigenous knowledge about health and wellness. Siegel highlights that the need for truth and reconciliation to ensure that difficult and painful histories are shared rather than hidden. Such actions can advocate honest interaction, which can lead to increased social empathy and promote healing. Without a full account of the harms done to Black counseling psychology graduate students and psychologists, past and present, it will be difficult to move forward and create a transformed counseling psychology that combats anti-Black racism, disrupts colonialism, and prioritize the dismantling of inequities within our discipline, our division, and society. However, important such acknowledging and accounting is, the ultimate goal of truth and reconciliation must be transformation and liberation. Given the challenges that exist in enacting reparations within our profession, we must expand the mechanisms and approaches that we use to stop harm, level the playing field, and ensure satisfaction among Black counseling psychology graduate students and psychologists. We must also simultaneously address how others within counseling psychology have been harmed by the practices, policies, structures, and actions of our discipline and division. It is possible to center the work of uprooting anti-Black racism while also dismantling Indigenous erasure, protecting the bodily autonomy of all people, uprooting unexamined whiteness and white supremacy, uplifting the cultural perspectives of all racial and religious groups, following the creative and liberatory leadership of queer and trans people, and interrupting all forms of oppression. In fact, it is critical that we work on multiple fronts because all forms of oppression are connected and rely on one another to create structural power imbalances. Anti-Black racism fuels and populates all other forms of racism. Racism in all its ugliness doubles down on sexism. And of course, sexism is the foundation for cisgenderism and heterosexism. These interconnections are why interlocking forms of oppression inflame and multiply the harm experienced by those with intersecting marginalized identities. To build liberatory futures, we must be able to simultaneously prioritize and address all the harms, disrupt their cross-contamination, curate new ways of being in the world. As Audre Lorde said, there's no thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So there's absolutely no transformation also without accountability. And another poem by Audre Lorde speaks to this well. Sometimes we are blessed with being able to choose the time and the arena and the matter of our own revolution. But more usually, we must do battle where we are standing. As counseling psychologists, we have long believed in transformation that is developmental, holistic, contextual, strengths-based, justice-oriented, and prevention-focused. However, we frequently prioritize individual interventions within a therapeutic context and rarely engage in community-based engagement and interventions. We often design interventions with limited direct knowledge of the communities we serve. These practices must stop. It is time that we leave our clinical offices and our research labs, engage with different literatures and ways of knowing, and invest our time and resources in our communities, serving those who are left behind and harmed by the very institutions that we are part of and support, such as colleges and universities, hospitals, VAs, community mental health clinics, and independent practice. We must begin by transforming ourselves, not in a self-involved way, but in community with those we want to serve and study. We must interrogate our training, our institutions, and the structures that support the work we do. Transformation on the individual and institutional level cannot occur without accountability. We must engage in a deep study of transformative and restorative justice and what that means for individuals and for our profession. That means reading, listening, honoring the work of community activists and healers who are innovative change makers in ways that will never get published in academic journals. We can and must value their understanding of human behavior and change without requiring a randomized controlled treatment study to prove their methods are valid. Reviewing RCT is the gold standard of research when such research usually relies on racially homogeneous samples and rarely focuses on culture-specific interventions is short-sighted and harmful. There are other ways to gather an understanding of what works and doesn't work in meeting the needs of marginalized communities. From these community leaders, we can access the tools and practices we need to transform our discipline. And that begins with an accountability practice. Adrienne Marie Brown, a Black queer writer, facilitator, visionary, and activist, says accountability is often discussed as something that lives outside of us. We have to be accountable for things we do to others and the things that we said we would do that we didn't. Brown further suggests that we not outsource our accountability by relying on others to hold us accountable, but rather deepen our practice of internal accountability. Mia Mingus, a queer, physically disabled, Korean transracial and transnational adoptee, writer, trainer, and activist, describes accountability as occurring in 4 acts: self-reflection, apology, repair, and change behavior. Mingus shares, true accountability is not only apologizing, understanding the impact your actions have caused on yourself and others, making amends or reparations to the harmed parties, but most importantly, true accountability is changing your behavior so that harm, violence, and abuse does not happen again. One of the most powerful experiences of my life was a trip I took to South Africa as a chaperone to a group of young musicians. While there, we visited Robben Island, which is where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned for 18 years for challenging apartheid. Post-apartheid, there was a reckoning as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission between the guards and prisoners on Robben Island. The guards sat and listened to the stories of harm and trauma endured by the Black men who were imprisoned there. Today, as envisioned by Mandela's focus on reconciliation, Black former inmates and white former guards work together to run tours on Robben Island with a critical and reparative lens. That model of accountability offers us a path forward to stop the harm, level the playing field, and transform our profession. Developing an accountability practice as a discipline and division will not be easy, but luckily Mingus and others show us the way forward. There are 3 primary areas within counseling psychology where there is significant harm that needs to be addressed and repaired and transformed. Those three ways are pathways to the profession, training programs, and the science practice advocacy focus of our discipline. Don't worry, I'm almost done. As a profession, we must be willing to admit that we have done harm and continue to do harm. All we need to do to confirm this reality is spend time with our students, especially our students of color, our LGBTQ students, our financially struggling students, our marginalized students, and listen to them deeply. Or talk with clients who have had negative, even harmful experiences with their therapists, and engage in community with those around us who are unprotected, ignored, and actively harmed by the systems we helped create to help them. Based on feedback from Jernigan and Associates received from counseling psychology students and colleagues, our profession and even SCP are sometimes experienced as performative. It is time for us to authentically and with humility enact our values personally and professionally. First, we need to rethink pathways to our profession. We cannot wait for prospective students to come to us. If we want to transform our profession, we need to embed ourselves in our communities and look for healers and change agents and help them see that with transformed tools and values of counseling psychology, they can build a liberatory future for their communities. And if we want to truly diversify our profession, we must center the voices and perspectives of those who've been marginalized. Being at the table is not change if assimilation is the expectation. We need shared governance with our students and early career professionals. Without that, it's all window dressing, and it's just another type of harm visited on marginalized individuals and communities. Second, we must completely transform our training. We are embedded in a higher education system that demands allegiance to its underlying values and is often inflexible, inhumane, and requires, or at least expects, students to assimilate to the underlying culture. The GREs provide the perfect window into the challenges we face. The GREs were dropped during COVID for many, but now programs are readopting them as the standard. In my own department, we have engaged in many seemingly dead-end discussions. The argument for the GREs assumes that it predicts who will succeed, which faculty prioritize because of concerns over admitting ill-prepared students. Interestingly, this gatekeeping never seems to concern itself with the elimination of the many students, especially students of color, who could transform our field, but are never given the chance. We must invest in creating programs that prioritize student success through care and consideration of what they need to thrive and complete their degrees without losing themselves. Acknowledging the harm done in our training programs is essential, not only because that is where much of the harm occurs, but because that's where we can make the most profound changes. What we teach and how we teach must radically change. We can no longer tinker around the edges, but instead we must reimagine and redesign our curriculum by centering new frameworks that help us to reconsider and transform our work. We must also dig deep into the work of our counseling psychology colleagues who radically are transforming what is possible. Consider the amazing scholarship of the Radical Healing Collective, of Academics for Black Lives, the Neighborhood Healers Project, funded by SAMHSA and led by Dr. Candace Hargens to develop a community-based support system within the Black community of Lexington, Kentucky, or the brilliant work on trans and gender non-binary individuals and communities being led by Dr. Stephanie Budge, M. Matsuno, and Sergio Dominguez, and others. Cadenas and McVerter, in their work on critical consciousness and vocational psychology, offer a powerful example of accountability in their critical examination of how the vocational work of counseling psychologists has done harm. Finally, we need to transform and reimagine the science practice advocacy focus of our discipline. That means making advocacy and community engagement central to both science and practice. We need to teach and conduct research that meets the needs of our communities rather than developing research based on researcher or institution needs. Science can and should be used to inform and shape policy in ways that dismantle inequities. Engaging in participatory action or community-based research is another form of advocacy that we can utilize. Centering advocacy in our clinical placements is also critical. That means engaging with communities to discover their mental health or physical or psychological needs, and then working with them to develop clinical placements to meet those needs. We should model how to set up pro bono community-based practices to help those who are not being served by our healthcare system. Lastly, we should see science, practice, and advocacy as an unbreakable trio. that perpetually influence, inform, and challenge each other in a meaningful and integrated manner. Counseling psychology is at a crossroads. We can continue our current path that is manicured, familiar, and more of the same. At this point, the incremental changes we have been making only continue the harm and fail to make the structural changes needed to meet this moment. Or we can take another path. That road is less groomed, and the final destination is unknown. If we are truly committed to transforming counseling psychology, we must build an accountability practice which requires us to dig deep, take risks, be bold, and take radical action. Angela Davis reminds us that radical simply means grasping things at the root. It's time for counseling psychology to get radical. I want to end with gratitude and sincere appreciation for the many named and unnamed individuals who have assisted me in this past year. My ability to survive and thrive as SCP president while simultaneously serving as a full-time professor and working as an engaged member of my campus and community would not be possible without the amazing work of Debbie Nolan, SCP Executive Director, and the AMC team, along with Siobhan Moore-Laban, SCP President-elect, and Mary O'Leary Wiley, past president. The executive board and the many leaders and members of our counseling psychology family who have supported and mentored me. There are too many of you to name who have encouraged and supported me along the way. Please know that I so appreciate your wise counsel and amazing work. Although I am unable to name all of you, I do want to lift up the work of Dr. Annalise Singh, a visionary instigator and friend who has shown me and us the way towards liberation, if we choose to take it. I also want to shout out the tireless work. You can clap for Annalise. I also want to shout out the tireless work of those who contributed to my presidential initiatives, even though many of you, most of you, were overtaxed and exhausted from social justice work. I want to sincerely thank my advisees and mentees this year and over the years who have been patient with me and taught me so much about being an inclusive and justice-oriented mentor. I also could not have given so much of my time and energy without the grace, love, and support of my partner, Rochelle, and our children, Justice and Mandela. As I end, I want to leave you with a quote by Bell Hooks, a writer, thinker, and activist extraordinaire. The moment we choose to love, we begin to move against domination, against oppression. The moment we choose to love, we begin the move towards freedom, to act in ways that liberate ourselves and others. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to call an audible and give us a 5-minute break since we started late, my talk went a little late, and we ought to get ready for the business meeting. So let's take 5 minutes and we will start the business meeting at 3:05. Thank you.